Sunday, during the summer of 2023, Ayana, Carl, and I ventured to Salisbury, North Carolina. Originally, Salisbury was home to many indigenous peoples, as it is located near a long-time trading route. As the north to south trading route improved, it gained the name the Great Wagon Road, as a large number of travelers began to use it. By the 1740s, the area was named after Salisbury, England, and was being settled by the Scots-Irish and German. The area's fertile lands and beauty caused many people to travel no farther and settle here. In fact, even a young Daniel Boone lived nearby and came here to sell his animal skins. However, we didn't travel here for that legendary frontiersman, but rather for the frontiersman Michael Peeler and his descendants. Our first stop was the Rowan County Museum, which is housed in the 1857 courthouse. Wagon Road, that's what my Peeler relatives came in on.
You know, the FDA sued us because they used to market with cherries. And so see, this bottle is an original one from 1914. And see how it has the cherries on it?
Right.
And it says cherry wine, kind of.
Yeah.
Well, the FDA sued us in 1928, and these poor people had to grind 28,000 bottles because it's false advertising.
Yeah, well.
And so this one bottle is $1,600. So
Wow.
if you have any of these around, they're made with a lot of money. This is a hand capper. So can you imagine doing all these bottles like this?
Wow.
So yeah, so this is our little. I just took you right here because this is, you know, if you're a relative of Mr. Peeler.
Right,
you know,
right.
You should see it.
Very cool. Yes.
Yeah. And we have a great time. And this is the first factory. The Cheerwine factory. So if you go down to the hotel, you cross the railroad tracks, and it's on the left-hand side. And it's been turned into condos.
Very cool. Very cool.
And this is the time clock that we used to have. So you would have had a rack with a card with your name on it. You would have taken this knob and turned it, whether to in or out. You put it in the slot, you pull the button, and then they know what time you left and what time. You know, obviously, Rowan County was a rural county. Was founded by farmers primarily. At least all of the Lutherans that are here were of German descent. Pretty much brought their religion, and these are all basically original tools that were used back in that time that people just donate to us.
Right.
And then we talk about obviously picking the cotton and using the cotton for cloth and how we make it and all of that. And these are looms. They're very cool because the only color that they had was indigo. They did not have anything else. So if you see the colors, they had to boil bark. And so that's how they got the colors. The red is probably from strawberry plants. So the Gold Hill Mine, okay, little demo here. And then we have our wagon.
Look at that butter churn. Can you imagine having to churn for butter? That's just too much work. I'd have been skinny because I wouldn't have been churning for butter. Armed with hatchets, a group of 40 to 50 soldiers' wives stormed Salisbury to demand fair prices. If a business refused, they took the products and threatened violence. Cannonball they found. Can you imagine stumping you holding that in your yard? Good grief. They found a tooth. It's a prison site, from a prison site. So there was a Confederate prison here. Bird's eye view of the Confederate prison pen at Salisbury. It's used to transport the bodies from the home of our hospital to the mortuary. Collar for a slave. That's a collar. That's what they put on a slave neck. I ain't never heard of that. I mean, I believe it. Can you imagine having to wear that? Just like many early settlers to the area, the Peelers were of German descent. And just like many immigrants, the Peeler surname came about as its original spelling and pronunciation changed over time. In fact, the Peeler name can be linked to many variations of the name. all of which can be traced back to the Dramaic root word that means a lover. In our family, the surnames Peeler and Pelor come from our descendant Johannes Bueller. Johannes Bueller and his sons Jacob, David, and Michael sailed from London on a ship named the Molly, which was captained by John Hodgson. The four arrived in Philadelphia on September the 30th, 1727, where shortly thereafter Johannes pledged his oath of allegiance to the crown. While none of Jacob's descendants are known, those of David and especially Michael are well documented. In regards to Johannes' son David, he moved to the town of Indiana, Pennsylvania, after which his descendants began to use the last name Pelor. Some of David's notable descendants include his great-great-grandson David, who was a civil engineer whose research led to the development of the telegraph. Also, David's great-great-grandson Joseph and his son Joseph Elder Peeler were both representatives in the Pennsylvania legislature. But it is Johannes' youngest son Michael that brought us to North Carolina today. Around 1748, Michael decided to seek a home elsewhere, probably to acquire better lands and escape the cold northern climate. More than likely, he took the previously mentioned Great Wagon Road, which went from Pennsylvania through the Shenandoah Valley to Roanoke, Virginia. Then it crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains and down to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, before converging into smaller trading paths. It is unknown if Michael made this trip on foot or by horse. Such trips were usually done with others of similar means. It is possible Michael met his first wife while on this path, whose name has been lost over time. Eventually, Michael found himself on the Rowan County side of the Yadkin River, the same area that Daniel Boone would call home 4 years later in 1752. During this time, while there were settlers in the area, it was still a frontier filled with danger. After leaving the museum, we walked the streets of Salisbury admiring the brick architecture before driving around. Eventually, we ran into a historical marker on the side of what was the Yadkin Hotel. Charles Sparks chose Salisbury as his winter home for his Sparks World famous show because of its north-south and east-west railroad and nearby Spencer shops that refurbish his circus train each year before loading over 50 red and yellow rail cars for his annual tour. Sparks treated the town to performances. Circus days were declared a holiday for the schools, businesses. Thousands lined in the streets to watch parades of gilded wagons streaming with exotic animals. Local citizens welcomed performers and their families, and Salisbury was known as the town that loved the circus. The Yadkin Hotel was built in 1912 and was partially owned by L.D. Peeler, the creator of Cheerwine. However, today it is the Yadkin House Apartments, which house seniors and disabled adults. 126 years before the Yadkin Hotel's construction, in 1776, L.D. Peeler's forefather, Michael Bueller, entered the Revolutionary War. He enlisted as a corporal and was a guard in Captain John Kingsbury's artillery. After the war, it was not unheard of for people to change their names. This was done as a way of starting over after the brutality of war. So perhaps it is unsurprising that after the war, Michael began using the last name Peeler more frequently. In 1783, Michael was issued 2 land grants, one for 200 acres on Dutch Second Creek and the other for 250 acres on the opposite side of the creek. During his life, Michael was successful at growing his farm and a family. Michael's first wife bore him Anthony, Michael Jr., Peter, and Andrew. Michael then fathered John, Elizabeth, and Louis by his second wife, Margaret. During his life, he also helped raise money and materials to build a church. In 1801, Michael deeded 125 acres of the 250 acres to his son Anthony. What is most known about Michael comes from his March 10, 1807 will. This will was drawn up shortly before his passing. Originally, this document was housed in the Salisbury Courthouse. However, today it can be found in Raleigh, North Carolina at their library's records room. In Michael's will, son John receives 125 acres, plow and clevises for 2 horses, a 2-year-old mare, 1 axe and mattock, a saddle and bridle, 2 cows, a yearling, Bible, and when of age, 8 bushels of wheat and corn and 50 weight of pork yearly. Michael's wife Margaret received 2 beds, bedding, a spinning wheel, 2 cows, a calf, 1 bay mare and its colt, 6 pewter plates, 2 water pails, 1 saddle and bridle, 2 pots of her choice, 2 wash tubs, table, some utensils, and the house and milk house. Daughter Elizabeth received some forks and knives, 1 frying pan and 1 flesh fork, and 1 skimmer. Michael also instructed that Michael Jr. and Louis be executors over his will, and that they sell 80 acres to cancel out his debt, and that the rest of his property be divided equally among Anthony, Michael Jr., Peter, and Andrew. Besides the will, some evidence exists that Michael may have had an additional 415 acres, which he purchased from George Hellman, which was once part of a land grant belonging to Martin Miller. This land is believed to have been passed to Michael Jr. While not much is known of Michael's daughter Elizabeth, probably due to her death or marriage not being recorded, much is known about the other children. In regards to Michael's son Anthony, Anthony married Barbara and later Ann Carbinder. Anthony moved to the upstate of South Carolina near the Broad River in 1779. Anthony was the father of 5 children, Mary, Isaac, Jacob, Daniel, and Richmond, and the grandfather of 34. Interesting people from Anthony's lineage include Isaac Peeler, who was born in 1779. He was the owner of Peeler Island Plantation on the Broad River. During his life, he married Nancy Petty, Mary Gilkey, and lastly, Annie Deal. He fathered 14 children. Today, his grave is somewhere near his island, which is now called Goat Island. Reverend Barry Peeler. Barry was born in 1806. He was a preacher and a teacher. He married Emily McLenans in 1811. Of their children, Jane married into the Underwood family, and their sons Green and Aaron unfortunately perished during the Civil War. Their youngest son, Isaac, also a Confederate veteran, followed in his father's footsteps and became a pastor, teacher, and missionary. Interestingly, one of Reverend Isaac's children, Julian, became a doctor. Thomas Madison Peeler. Thomas was born in 1848. At the age of only 18, he became a cowboy and a Western pioneer in Texas. He was known for his accuracy with a pistol, and he became the manager of the Hackknife Ranch. He also moved to Idaho and then Colorado before coming back to Texas to buy his own ranch. He married Alice Jane Irving in 1897, and together they had 7 children. George Lynch Peeler. George was born in 1815. He was a jeweler and contributed to the invention of the hypodermic needle. Cynthia Elizabeth Peeler. Cynthia was born in 1854, and she married James Alexander Jones. Her husband was kin to Frances Jones Dandridge, mother of the would-be Martha Washington. In addition, George Washington's aunt, Nana Ball Fox, had a descendant, Martha Lavinia Kendrick, 1836, who married John P. Peeler. Martha and John had a son named Samuel Glenn Peeler. He married Cora Arnold, and together they had 5 children. Samuel was one of Mississippi's first rural mail carriers and a champion chicken breeder. He strongly believed in diversifying farming and added pecan trees and an apple orchard to his own farm. Jasper Samuel Peeler. Jasper was born in 1887. He married Maggie Virginia Davis. They had 8 children and started the Peeler Dairy Farm in Gaffney, South Carolina. While this dairy no longer exists, some of his descendants have established the Milky Way Farms in Anderson, South Carolina. In addition, some of Jasper's other descendants became great political leaders in South Carolina. In regards to Michael's son Peter, Peter was born in 1764 in Rowan County and passed in what is now Cleveland County in 1813. Peter had 5 children and 40 grandchildren. While no documentation exists proving Peter served in the Revolutionary War, a silver belt buckle he supposedly wore during the war has been passed on through generations. In Peter's will, he gives his wife Elizabeth a brown mare named Fly, a saddle and bridle, half of the furniture, 2 cows and a calf, and an old slave woman named Dinah to serve her as long as she was a widow. To his son Barnett, Peter gave his Lincoln County plantation and 2 tracts of land in South Carolina called Rolling Williamson and Trap Swing. To his son David, Peter gave the McKay tract of land at Knob Creek, a colt, and the slaves Sid and Isaac. To his son John, Peter gave the lower 40 acres of where he lived, a new saddle and a mare, as well as slaves Peg and Bill. Son Joseph received the upper land of where Peter lived, all of the money Peter got from his father Michael's inheritance, a young colt, and slaves Sam and Jim. To daughter Nancy, Peter gave the sum of $1 and no more. And for his sons David, John, and Joseph, he provided money for their schooling. Some of the interesting people in Peter's line include Barnabas Peeler, also referred to as Barney. Barney was born in 1790. He lived in Rutherford County and married Sarah Hoyle. During 1823, he wrote a letter to his brother David describing how good the crops were, yet how no money was to be had from the market, and how hard it was to provide for his 8 children. He also describes the prices of things and how he had made a recent trip to Tennessee in search of new lands. However, he felt the lands too high, trade bad, and water poor. Barney then ends the letter by telling of a great sickness that had come to the area, a fever that brought with it much death. Also, interestingly, in the Peeler book, there is a photo of Barney's house. David Peeler. Dr. David Peeler was born in 1845. He married Isabella Hendrickson and later Harriet Crowley. He fathered 12 children. Of his children, Samuel Harvey was a farmer, carpenter, and owned a grocery store in Moberly, Missouri. Son Cameron owned a grocery store in Bremerton, Washington. Daughter Sarah and her husband owned a grocery store in Denver, Colorado. In addition, his daughter Daisy and her husband owned an auto repair shop in Taft, California. Peter Peeler. This Peter Peeler was born in 1818. He was the father of Alfred Peeler, the mayor of Cherryville, North Carolina. Notably, Peter was on the floor of the legislature at the time the state seceded from the Union. Interestingly, he was opposed to this. However, during the war, his son John fought for 4 years. It is documented that John was wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness and that the back of his skull had to be removed, yet he survived. Later at Appomattox, John fired the last shot. This occurred after the order to stop firing was given. It is recorded that John then declared, "Damn 'em, I'll give 'em another one." And then he let go, tearing through columns of the enemy at close range. After the war, John moved to Texas. David Peeler. This David Peeler was married to Sarah Wilcox and fathered 10 children. He was a pioneer in the state of Missouri. He settled there in 1794. While not formally educated, he was smart and encouraged the education of his children. He was well respected and also had many notable friends. As a result, he was elected as magistrate, then served as a judge before being elected as Missouri's representative. Andrew Felix Hoyle. Andrew was the youngest son of Nancy Peeler Hoyle. After getting his medical degree, he practiced medicine in Tennessee, California, and then in 1855 immigrated to Chile, South America, where he married and had 4 children. In regards to Michael's son Andrew, Andrew had 5 children and 23 grandchildren. In Andrew's line, some interesting descendants include Crockett Peeler. Crockett was born in 1820. He served for 4 years in the Civil War with his brothers John Henry and Andrew Peeler. Vester Peeler. Vester was born in 1880. Tragically, he was killed in 1934 in a sawmill accident in Blacksburg, South Carolina. Forrest Peeler. Forrest was born in 1896. Unfortunately, he died while single in World War I. He served for 18 months in the Rainbow Division Artillery. Interestingly to me, some of these Peelers married into the Randolph and Huey families of Gaffney, South Carolina. After leaving Salisbury's downtown, we drove to the Union Lutheran Church. As of today, this cemetery is home to 42 Peelers, most of which no link in kinship can be found. The oldest Peeler grave documented here is that of Anthony Peeler, 1777 to 1828. He was the son of Michael Peeler, who was born in Pennsylvania, so not that of Johannes. This Anthony married Anna Margaretha Redwine, and they had 5 children. If we are kin to these Peelers, who can say? The connection would probably be far back in history to when our family lived in Germany. We came to this cemetery in search of Michael's son John. In regards to Michael's son John, as previously mentioned in his father's will, John was underage when Michael passed. On March 16th of 1810, John married Elizabeth Brown Miller, who is also buried here. During John and Elizabeth's life, they had Mary Seifert, 1911, Solomon, 1813, Caleb, 1814, Sophia Casper, 1815, Catherine Johnson, 1817, Martha Lingle, 1819, Moses, 1820, Simon D. and Leah Shriver, both born in 1822, and Jacob, 1825. Unfortunately for John and Elizabeth, their son Moses did die at an early age. Moses passed away at only the age of 23 of an unknown cause. At the time, he was single and had no heirs. Interesting people in John's line include Charles B. Peeler. Charles began his career by going to East Florida seminaries, then to the University of Florida. Charles finished his education by studying law at the University of Nashville, after which he began practicing law. By 1898, Charles moved back to Florida, where he began working as a judge. Interestingly, Charles was submitted to practice law before the Supreme Court. During his life, Charles married Irene Brennan Dillsbury, and they had 1 son. Unfortunately, their son, Theodore W. Peeler, passed away while studying law in Jacksonville. In addition, Charles's brother James was also a judge. James married Madge Fields, and they had 6 children together. Their baby Betty was born in 1923 and also lived in Jacksonville, Florida. Myrtle Peeler, daughter of Rowan and Martha Peeler, also ended up in Florida, working in Gainesville as a stenographer. Dr. Casper Peeler. Casper was born in 1892 and was the son of Rowan and Martha and the grandson of Solomon and America. Casper married Anna Laura and they had 1 child. While it appears that most of John's descendants left North Carolina, Esther Peeler and John Stafford's daughters, Mary and Leila, both remained in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Interestingly, none of John and Elizabeth's children ended up being buried here with them. While here, we also couldn't find the graves of John or Elizabeth. However, later I did find Elizabeth's grave online, and I do believe that John is also buried here. I did, however, find the grave of Reverend Samuel Rothrock, who I will mention shortly. Carrie Josephine Peeler, Julius Alexander Peeler, and Martha Josephine Peeler. Paul Peeler and Mary Peeler. Cora, wife of R.M. Peeler. Thomas Frederick, son of Mary. Henry Quincy, son of Cora. Here's some Peeler graves. Julia A., 1832 to 1907, with some Peeler children. Hey, here's some Peelers. Samuel Peeler, born 1801, 18 to 1863, 50 years old. Can't make out that Peeler. 16 days. Catherine Mary A. Miller. Maybe not. I can't read that. Pleasant Bedwine. That's what it sounds like. Mary L. Peeler. 1830 something. Died 1914. Michael Peeler. Not sure about that. He was married to Elizabeth Peeler, 1800s. H.M.J. Peeler. Mary L., wife of D. Peeler, 1893. This could be it. They're old. I don't know. You can't even read them. The Revolutionary War. Hey, Paul Peeler. Grant Peeler Sr. After leaving the Union Lutheran Church of Salisbury, we drove towards Rockwell, North Carolina, and Grace Church. On the way, I tried to take in the beautiful landscape and stayed on the lookout for any old farm buildings, as they may have belonged to Michael Peeler. In regards to Michael's son Lewis, Lewis married Eve Hartman and then later Regina Fisher. It is believed that he fathered his 2 children, Daniel and Paul, with Regina. Of Lewis's children, Daniel married Sarah Trexler in 1830. Together they had Caleb, Jacob, Moses, Lasita, Margaret, John, and Julius. Unfortunately, Lewis's grandson John died during the Civil War. Lewis's other son Paul also married in 1830 to a woman named Catherine, and they had Solomon and Lavinia. While little is known about the life and lineage of Lewis, it is known that after his death, he was buried on December 6, 1847, at around the age of 70. Lewis was buried at the Lower Stone Church, and during his funeral, Revelation 14:13 was read in German by Reverend Samuel Rothrock. In addition, Lewis's wife, Regina Fisher Peeler, is recorded online as being the first Peeler buried here. However, she is surely not, as it is believed that Lewis's father Michael and Michael's second wife Martha are also buried here in unmarked graves. Interestingly, in regards to Regina, she is mentioned in Reverend Samuel Rothrock's diary on page 598. as being buried at the Lower Stone Church on Monday, June 2nd, 1845. In addition, after doing much research, I can find no evidence that Paul or Daniel were buried here with their parents, Louis and Regina. In regards to Michael's son, Michael Jr., while Michael Jr.'s wife or wives are unknown, we do know that Michael Jr. fathered Mary Trexler, Michael III, Peter, John, Henry, David, Margaret Strafford, and Sally Hallihauser. He also was the grandfather of 53. As mentioned previously, when Michael Sr. died, some of his land was given to Michael Jr. This land was known as the Old Home Place. Originally, a log cabin was built there by either Michael Sr. or Michael Jr. On November the 4th of 1806, the orphan Sophia Klutz, age 13, was bound to Michael Jr. until she became legal. By this year, Michael had already fathered 5 children, so there is no evidence that he treated her any different than the rest of his children. While Michael Sr. had been a member of the 1745 Lower Stone Church congregation and raised money and materials for its construction, it wasn't until 1771 when Michael Jr. and his brother Anthony, as well as several other citizens, petitioned the English Assembly to excuse them from certain taxes as they were engaged in building the church. Probably due to the Revolutionary War and issues with funding, it was 1795 before Michael Jr. and a dozen other men were able to erect the Lower Stone Church. It is believed that Michael Jr. is also buried at the Lower Stone Church with his father Michael Sr., his mother Martha, his brother Louis, and his sister-in-law Regina. It is believed that Michael Jr. passed in 1830, as this is the year his land was divided. After his death, Michael Jr.'s estate was given to his sons, John, Henry, and David. Michael's 3 sons lived on the property. David even lived in the old Peeler log cabin for many years. Later, the cabin of the old home place was converted into a barn, and as of 1935, it was still standing. However, I had no luck in finding its location as of today. 300 acres of the original off-land tract, which belonged to the Peeler family, now is part of the town of Rockwell, North Carolina. Some of Michael Jr.'s interesting descendants include Monroe Peeler. Monroe was born in 1849. He served in the Civil War for 4 years. Unfortunately, shortly after the end of the war, Monroe contracted a disease and passed away. George N. Smithdale. George was born in 1855 and was the son of Margaret S. Peeler and John Smithdale. He was the owner of the Smithdale Business College in Richmond, Virginia, a place where many Peelers came to be educated. Luther Henry Brown. Luther was born in 1874 and was the son of Martha Jane Peeler and Nathan Brown. Luther worked in Washington, D.C. as an engraver. James C. Goodson. James was born in 1905 and was the son of Sarah T. Alice Peeler and Daniel W. Goodson. James lived in China. Interestingly, James's older brother, Robert, who was born in 1894, was an engineer. Lawrence Tatum Peeler. Lawrence was born in 1899. He was the son of Reverend James A. Peeler. Unfortunately, Lawrence was killed in France during the World War in service of his country. Louis D. Peeler. Lewis was a farmer and a leading citizen in Rowan County. He invented and operated the Cheerwine Bottling Company and was part owner of the Yatkin Hotel. In addition, he was director at the First National Bank of Salisbury and a member of St. John's Lutheran Church. Lewis married Ellen Haushauser, and together they had 4 children. Their daughter Pauline married Dr. Walter Tatum. John Michael Peeler. John was born in 1872. He loved growing up on his family's farm, but as an adult, he became a banker at Salisbury Savings Bank and then Wachovia. But his real passions were teaching and spreading the gospel. Anthony Gregory Peeler. Anthony was also in banking and was the secretary and treasurer of Lexington United Banking Company. Anthony was also the bookkeeper for several variety stores, bakeries, and the Star Laundry Company. Besides this, Anthony organized the United Oil Company in Salisbury and was the director of Wachovia Bank and the Yatkin Hotel. As a hobby, Anthony enjoyed dealing in real estate. George D. Peeler. George and his wife Carrie Miller Peeler had several children. Their son Burley was a station agent at the Southern Railway Company. Their daughter Eula, a teacher. Their son Harry, the proprietor of the Peeler Candy Company in Kannapolis, North Carolina. Unfortunately, after George's death, their daughter Helen had to be adopted by her uncle J. Miller, and their son George Jr., born 1916, had to be adopted by Reverend Lee A. Peeler. John Wilker Peeler. John was born on March 18, 1861, on his great-grandfather Michael Peeler's farm. John wrote a record of history of the Peeler family, where most of this information came. John described writing the book as a thrilling process. He stated that certainly no one has a finer family than we, and that this can be found true by studying our interesting family history. John attended Catawba College and became a teacher. Later, John went to the Smithdale College of Business and then taught at the Institute of Greensboro, North Carolina. In 1899, John organized and served as secretary at Rockwell Casket Company. John went on to be elected to the Board of Commissioners and then later the Board of Education, which he was very proud of. John was also on the Board of Trustees for the Catawba College and a chairman of the Board of Managers at the Nazareth Orphan Home. John was a prominent citizen in Rockwell and retired from a 20-year public life, with 16 years of that time being on the county school board. Besides caring for the education and well-being of young people, John was also an active member at the Reformed Church and fathered 5 children. German poem over the north door. We go in our God's house with delighted hearts, in and out. God lets us still find the priceless treasure. The word of life, here he shows us heaven's gate, forgiveness of our sins, Grace Church. Daniel Peeler, 1841, and Mary Ritchie, 1871. Private Daniel Peeler, Confederate Army, North Carolina 1st Light Infantry. So that makes me think that could be his daddy. It's absolutely smooth. You can't tell. This says mother and father. And it says A. Peeler. Blessed are the dead that in the Lord die from now on. The Spirit says that they rest from their labors. Reverend Daniel B. Lurch. The gospel was his joy and song, even to his last breath. The milk he had proclaimed so long, he his support in death. The church's loss will all deplore, and shed the falling tear, since we shall see his face no more till Jesus shall appear. Colonel George Burgess was a Revolutionary patriot. Heller, 1853. Reverend Calvin Boyd Heller. This breezeway is dedicated to the worship of the glory of God in loving memory of Mary Gilly. Water system and fountain in memory of John V. Fisher. To God's honor is built this church, which you here see, by a people who acknowledge God and identify themselves after Jesus Christ. They also, with Him, are one body and signify themselves the Reformed 1795 Grace Church, the end. After leaving the church, I looked on the map and drove us to a part of the Dutch Second Creek. I did this in order to look at the creek that once flowed through Michael Sr.'s land. Besides businessmen, the Michael Jr. line has an astonishing amount of preachers. These men were all born in the Rowan area, and most of them grew up on farms. These men also had parents who encouraged education, whether it be at a private school, the Peeler Schoolhouse, the Old Red Schoolhouse, or at Granite Quarry High School. In addition, most of these men attended Catawba College before acquiring further education. These men include Reverend Jacob N. Learley, son of May Peeler and Reverend J.M.L. Learley. While he ministered in Iowa, his brother Ray was the sheriff of Rowan County, and his sister May married an attorney in Ohio, Reverend Simon D. Peeler, who was a profound thinker and spreader of the Methodist faith. Son of Margaret Peeler, Dr. Paul Stiffended was a minister and pioneer in the medical field. He was also the director of Wittenberg College and later Carthage College. In addition, he was a probate judge and served 6 churches and had 5 built. His son, Calvin Stifford, born in 1850, followed in his footsteps and also became a pastor. Reverend Shuford Peeler was born in 1875. He organized and constructed the Reformed Church in Greensboro, North Carolina, and later another church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Reverend Lee Alexander was born in 1886 and was the son of Sarah Ann Peeler. He was the pastor of the First Reformed Church in Albemarle, and later organized a 300-member congregation for the St. John Reformed Church in Kannapolis, North Carolina. Reverend Banks Peeler was the pastor of the First Church of Burlington. Reverend George Lingle, whose mother was a Peeler, was a pastor of a leading church in the county and a teacher at Granite Quarry High School. In addition, he helped renovate several other local churches and even had the Haven Church in Salisbury built. Reverend Charles M. Peeler was an honor graduate at Winthrop. He pastored many important churches and united the South Carolina Conference of Methodist Episcopal Churches South. Reverend James Peeler attended Catawba and then Weaverville College. While being a pastor, he was also a father of 4 children. Reverend John Calvin Peeler was born in 1886. He attended Catawba College and pastored the Reformed Church in Lenoir, North Carolina. Reverend Joseph T. Peeler pastored several churches in South Carolina, including churches in St. Matthews, Lake City, Camden, the Trinity Church in Charleston, and a church in Kingstree, South Carolina. Son of Sarah Peeler, Reverend James Lappard was first a teacher at Klutz School before attending Catawba University. He then traveled, spreading the gospel first to Ohio and then Florida. Reverend Augustus Peeler was born in 1886. He was a member of the Lower Grace Reformed Church and a graduate of Catawba College. After graduating, he traveled to Ohio, Virginia, Kansas, and Winston-Salem. Reverend Luther Peeler. He attended Rutherford College and then pastored throughout South Carolina. During Luther's career, he had several churches repaired and had the Shalom Church in Barnwell, South Carolina built. After exploring Rockwell, North Carolina, where many of the Peeler descendants still call home, we had to grab some snacks and a cheer of wine before heading back to our home in South Carolina. If you are in the Peeler family, I would love to hear from you. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it. And as always, thanks for watching.
Nothing says German